Hi, welcome to our channel where we share the most intriguing stories. When Jason Ward returned home, he expected silence and open skies. Instead, he found bulldozers ripping through his grandfather's land and a stranger's name on the deed. What began as a property dispute would unravel into fraud, lies, and a war no one saw coming. I had been gone for just over 3 weeks, buried in meetings and negotiations in Washington, the kind of polished corporate purgatory where everyone smiles like hired assassins. By the time my rental car turned off the main road and onto the familiar stretch of dusty gravel leading to my land, I was already thinking about quiet, about wide open space, about the satisfaction of finally turning my grandfather's property into something living again. What I saw instead made my foot slam on the brakes so hard the seatbelt nearly strangled me. Where there should have been raw earth and wind-bent grass, there was chaos. Yellow steel arms clawed at the ground like mechanical insects. Cement trucks idled, coughing dust into the air. Trenches had been carved straight through the center of my property, and fresh concrete slabs lay where mesquite trees had stood. Along the dirt road ran bright-colored stakes marked with bold lettering. Section 3B, Ridgeview HOA Development. Temporary gravel paths sliced through my land as if someone had taken a ruler and a grudge to it. I stepped out of the car slowly, the heat wrapping around me like a threat. Every instinct screamed that this wasn't a misunderstanding. This was invasion. I walked straight toward the nearest excavator and waved both arms until the operator reluctantly killed the engine. The noise died down enough for the foreman to approach, helmet tucked under his arm, clipboard clutched like a shield. "You need to shut this down immediately," I said, keeping my voice level with more effort than it deserved. "This is private property." The man didn't even blink. He flipped open his folder and produced a laminated set of papers that looked annoyingly official. Contractual stamps, county seals, signatures. According to the document, the land had been approved for residential expansion under Ridgeview HOA. Fully permitted, fully authorized, signed by their board president. A name jumped out at me from the signature line. Karen Malloy. I told him I was the legal owner, that this land had clean title, updated boundaries, and not 1 inch of it belonged to any homeowners association. He shrugged with the casual indifference of a man being paid hourly. "Boss says it's cleared. We're just doing what the paperwork says." So I called the police. While I waited, I did what my grandfather had drilled into me as a kid. Document everything. I took photos of the machinery, the boundary stakes, the fresh concrete bleeding into the soil. I filmed the workers, the truck plates, the makeshift sign staked into my ground like a territorial insult. The patrol unit arrived with 2 deputies who looked equal parts bored and confused. They reviewed my deed on my tablet, compared it with the foreman's permits, then sighed in the universal language of law enforcement for "this is going to be paperwork hell." Their conclusion was impressive in its uselessness. The construction authorization appeared valid enough to continue until a formal dispute was resolved. As if summoned by the devil's own scheduling system, a black SUV rolled up at the edge of the site. Out stepped Karen Malloy, tailored blazer, sunglasses far too expensive for genuine humility. Her smile had the warmth of refrigerated steel. She glanced at me the way you look at a malfunctioning vending machine. "Jason Ward, right?" she said, voice smooth, almost amused. "You really should stop causing scenes. This expansion was approved months ago. Your land has been listed as abandoned and non-utilized for years." I stared at her as if she had suggested the earth was optional. "You are standing on land I legally own," I said. "You're building on it, and you're doing so without permission." Karen exhaled dramatically and turned to one of the deputies. "You see what I mean? He's confused. We've had reports before. Stress-related behavior, paranoia. He insists the development is imaginary." That was bold. Straight-faced psychological assassination in the Texas sun. I almost admired the audacity. The deputy shifted uncomfortably, but Karen pressed on, her tone syrup-sweet and surgical. "We sympathize with Mr. Ward's situation, but this expansion is essential to our community's growth. He's been very reactive." Reactive. Right. Apparently, standing on your own land while strangers pour concrete on it now classifies as emotional instability. As the excavators roared back to life behind us, Karen leaned closer, lowering her voice just enough to carry a chill. "You should go home, Jason, before you embarrass yourself any further." I looked past her at the shredded earth, at the machines chewing through my inheritance, and something inside me clicked into place. Calm, precise, focused. If this was going to be a war, at least I knew who declared it. The first official letter arrived before the dust from the excavators had even settled. It was slid into my mailbox with theatrical precision, embossed seal and legal font designed to intimidate, as if threats looked classier when printed on heavy paper. According to Ridgeview HOA's legal department, my erratic interference with an approved development project had been logged as disruptive and potentially dangerous. They claimed contractors had expressed fear, that I had raised my voice, that I had created an unstable working environment. And then came the line that made my jaw tighten so hard I could feel the muscle twitch. Recommendation for psychological evaluation due to signs of stress-induced paranoia. I laughed. Not politely, not intellectually, the kind of laugh you release when the alternative is throwing something expensive through a legally protected window. 2 days later, their attorney filed an emergency motion requesting a temporary restraining order against me from my own land. The basis: alleged verbal aggression and unpredictable behavior toward construction staff. They painted me as a volatile recluse who imagined ownership claims over terrain already integrated into municipal development plans. They even attached statements from 2 so-called witnesses who swore I had screamed obscenities and threatened machinery. I had not raised my voice once, but apparently reality had become negotiable. The local news caught wind of it with irritating speed. A short segment aired describing a property dispute delaying much-needed housing expansion, complete with slow pan shots of the active construction and a phrase that still makes my skin crawl. Concerned community members fear the unpredictability of the isolated landowner. Apparently, defending your own property now qualified as a personality disorder. Karen did not miss her moment. She held a brief press appearance outside the development entrance, speaking in tones that suggested compassion while leaning heavily on implication. "We are deeply concerned for Mr. Ward," she said, adjusting her designer sunglasses. "Multiple residents have reported hostile interactions. We hope he finds the help and clarity he needs." Clarity. Nothing clarifies reality like watching someone else build a manufactured suburb on the soil your grandfather surveyed by hand. I did not spiral. I did not react emotionally. I went into operational mode. I called Richard Hall, the only land rights attorney in 3 counties who enjoyed chewing through HOA corruption like a recreational sport. Within hours, he was walking my perimeter with a precision level and the expression of a man already smelling victory. At the same time, I contacted a private surveyor I had worked with years before, a meticulous professional named Ed Ramirez who trusted data more than people. He brought his full mobile unit, GPS aerial mapping gear, and an attitude that suggested someone had offended his profession. While the paperwork machinery ground into motion, Ridgeview made their next move. Just after midnight on a windless Tuesday, I received a live feed alert from the temporary security cameras I had installed near the western border. The site was active, floodlights burning, workers attempting to pour foundation beyond even the newly falsified perimeter. I was dressed and in my truck within minutes. The sheriff's patrol met me at the main access point. The same deputy as before, now wearing a tired expression that said he had realized this was going to be more than a zoning inconvenience. I showed him live coordinates, site maps, and property markers. The workers claimed authorization. I claimed ownership. The situation hovered between farce and felony. The sheriff finally shut down the night work, citing trespass until formal review could be concluded. Meanwhile, Karen had the audacity to email Richard directly demanding my compliance and removal from the project boundary for safety reasons. Safety from myself. Richard responded with a single sentence. "You are building on private property, and we will be seeking immediate damages for encroachment, defamation, and coordinated extortion." The tone shifted. Not publicly yet, but you could feel it. Like the air pressure changes before a storm throws everything back where it belongs. 3 days after the sheriff shut down the nocturnal circus, Ed Ramirez stood in the middle of what used to be my eastern boundary, staring at his tablet as if it had personally insulted his entire bloodline. "Jason," he muttered, "this isn't just wrong. This is surgically wrong." His team had finished running their independent survey grid across the land, mapping every corner, slope, and elevation point. The results did not whisper, they shouted. More than half of the area now under construction fell squarely inside my legally recorded perimeter. Not near, not ambiguous, inside, deep inside. Ed overlaid his live readings with the archived satellite data stored under my grandfather's name, and that was when the real significance hit me. My grandfather had not just been a surveyor. He had been obsessive, precise, almost prophetically prepared. Hidden inside my inherited documentation was a reference to his supplemental registry, a private digital archive he had synced with federal geospatial records, embedding fixed coordinate signatures along the borders of the property using GPS. Elevation markers that could not be altered without triggering discrepancies at the national level. Those markers were still there, glowing like beacons of truth on Ed's screen. We ran the data through the Federal Land Registry interface and within minutes received the confirmation stamp, immutable, verified. Recorded decades before Ridgeview HOA had even existed as a gleam in some developer's overdrafted checkbook. Richard arrived with a portable workstation and the predator's grin of a man who rarely lost when opponents tried to counterfeit geography. We compiled everything into a formal evidence package: geodetic comparisons, cross-referenced deed images, time-stamped coordinates, and grandfather's original margin notes scanned from paper that still smelled faintly like cedar and ink. By late afternoon, Richard had submitted a cease and desist order to the county commissioner's office with an attached fraud notification request. We filed a formal complaint against Kent and Ryder Development Group for illegal encroachment and falsified documentation. The language was deliberate, cold, and devastating. The response from Ridgeview was immediate and theatrically outraged. Karen issued a statement accusing me of blocking community investment and delaying residential growth for personal vendetta purposes. She even attached what she claimed was an updated map showing my lot marginally reduced to accommodate infrastructure as per development necessity. The signature at the bottom was barely disguised, a rushed imitation of mine. Slanted, heavy, incorrect down to the pressure pattern. Ed spotted it within 10 seconds. "That signature's about as real as a vegan barbecue contest," he said dryly. Richard forwarded the forged document straight to the Regional Land Claims Office with a formal allegation of identity misuse. That triggered the next phase. An independent auditor from the State Land Authority scheduled an emergency perimeter verification review. Ridgeview suddenly found themselves dealing not with a stubborn landowner, but with state-level oversight, and there was a noticeable wobble in their posture. Later that evening, while the sky darkened over the battered soil, a crew from Kent and Ryder attempted to adjust the boundary stakes. I intercepted them before even one could be pulled. When the foreman protested, I handed him a copy of the federal validation document and calmly suggested that continuing work might qualify as criminal trespass rather than ambitious optimism. For the first time since this began, someone on their side hesitated. They packed up their tools in silence, engines idling nervously, and drove off without another word. The ground finally ran quiet, and the silence felt significant. The county did not move like a startled animal. It moved like a machine that had finally noticed sand in its gears. 2 unmarked sedans pulled onto my property just after sunrise, followed by a third vehicle bearing the discreet emblem of the Regional Land Commission. Men and women stepped out in pressed shirts and windproof jackets, carrying equipment that looked far too serious to be wasted on a confused landowner with stress issues, as Karen so affectionately described me. They introduced themselves with the sterile politeness of people who preferred facts over theatrics: survey engineers, compliance specialists, a representative from the Texas State Land Office. They did not shake Karen's hand when she arrived 10 minutes later in her immaculate SUV, accompanied by a junior attorney who already looked like he regretted his career choices. The verification process was clinical, ruthless, and beautifully indifferent to ego. Laser measurement tools replaced wooden stakes. Drones swept patterns over trenches and partially poured foundations. My grandfather's digital coordinates were cross-referenced with county GIS overlays in real time. Every scan confirmed what Ed had already proven. The development had not just crossed the line, it had bulldozed straight through it. Karen attempted to intercept one of the inspectors, speaking in urgent undertones about approved revisions and development efficiency. He listened just long enough to tell her that her revised documents did not match any registered amendment in the county planning portal. The junior attorney tried to protest. The inspector told him to stop talking. By midday, the atmosphere had soured visibly. Kent and Ryder's site supervisor arrived in a panic, Whisper arguing with someone on the phone, while a second state representative typed furiously on a tablet connected to their internal database. The words formal irregularity and procedural violation floated through the air like exposed wiring. Then the real split occurred. One of the commissioners requested access to all original permit submissions, not copies, originals, digital and physical. When they reviewed the metadata, timestamps didn't align, signatures routed through unverified IP sources, approval trails that skipped mandatory review nodes. It was no longer a boundary issue, it was a paper crime scene. Karen noticed the shift before anyone said it aloud. Her usual composure fractured at the edges as she launched into louder explanations, casting sidelong glances toward the Kent and Ryder supervisor, who now avoided eye contact like a guilty teenager. I stood slightly apart, arms crossed, watching the building tension like a structural crack spreading across concrete. The moment everything snapped was almost quiet. A county official turned to Karen and informed her that a temporary halt order had been authorized, effective immediately. All activity on the disputed area was frozen pending investigation into falsified documentation and unauthorized zoning expansion. As if on cue, deputies arrived and began cordoning off the active sites. One of them pulled the Kent and Ryder development manager aside and read him his rights with practiced neutrality. His phone slipped from his hand and bounced once against the dry dirt. Karen protested, visibly unraveling, demanding to speak to someone in charge. The irony nearly made me laugh. State representatives walked past her as if she were background noise, focusing instead on seized documents now boxed by evidence technicians. When the arrest finally occurred, it was not dramatic. No shouting, no cameras. Just quiet compliance and handcuffs clicking shut as Brian Ryder was escorted off his own construction carpet. The silence that followed was deafening in its finality. For the first time since returning home, I felt the ground underneath my boots belonged to me again. But Karen's eyes told a different story. She was not finished. The freeze order should have ended it. Any rational organization would have backed off, hired lawyers, and quietly prepared damage control strategies. Ridgeview did the opposite. Less than 48 hours after Brian Ryder was escorted off the site, I received a certified envelope stamped with the unmistakable authority of litigation. Karen Malloy was officially suing me. Defamation, commercial sabotage, interference with contracted development. According to her filing, my false accusations and combative posture had caused irreparable harm to Ridgeview's reputation and financial stability. My legal team framed the notice on Richard's desk like a trophy. Desperation, he said with a gleam that bordered on enjoyment. They're trying to flip the narrative before the county tears through their records. The very next day, my email server flagged an attachment sent from an anonymous account. Inside was a document titled Property Relinquishment Consent, bearing my full name, a sloppy forgery of my signature, and a fabricated date indicating that I had voluntarily ceded a portion of my land for community development integration. Whoever created it had tried to be clever. They even embedded a scanned notary seal lifted from a legitimate office across town. Unfortunately for them, I had never been notarized by that office, ever. Richard forwarded the document to the state investigator with a quiet, lethal efficiency. Within hours, it was classified as evidence of active fraud. Meanwhile, Karen appeared on a regional business panel livestream, declaring that I had reversed my stance but now suffered cognitive dissonance. There was that angle again. Sanity by rumor. I did not respond verbally. I responded operationally. Additional surveillance systems were installed along my boundaries. Motion-sensitive optical cameras, LiDAR-based perimeter tracking, infrared night flood monitoring. If anyone so much as exhaled too enthusiastically near my fence line, I would know the shape of their soul. It wasn't paranoia, it was escalation preparedness, and it paid off faster than expected. One night just past midnight, the southern section of my main power grid flickered. Not a blackout, just an interruption, the kind meant to test how fast someone notices. Cameras caught two silhouettes approaching the junction box bordering the disputed zone. One crouched, tools flashed, then a slip. A spark, audible cursing. They bolted before the sheriff's unit arrived. The footage went straight into the ever-growing case file labeled Pattern of Intentional Harassment and Infrastructure Interference. Richard watched it twice and nodded slowly. "They're panicking," he said. "People only sabotage when truth gets too close." Meanwhile, within the Ridgeview community, word had begun to spread that the development group might not be as legitimate as they claimed. Concerned homeowners started emailing Richard directly, fearful that their deposits were tied to land that was now a legal minefield. Karen responded by organizing a public statement declaring that Ridgeview stood united and that all opposition stemmed from individual hostility. Her performance was impressive, her paperwork was not. The county issued a preliminary injunction banning all Ridgeview construction activity on disputed zones until full forensic analysis concluded. It was not a suggestion, it was a legal hammer. Karen read it out loud on a recorded board meeting that leaked online, the tremor in her voice barely concealed by formal syntax. I watched the clip once. That was enough. Then I went back outside, stepped onto the soil that had been torn and scarred by machines that never should have touched it, and waited for the next move, because I knew exactly what kind of person Karen Malloy was. And people like that never retreat quietly. The courtroom did not feel like a place of justice. It felt like a pressure chamber where every lie finally had to gasp for oxygen. They scheduled the first major hearing under the generous label of civil proceedings, but it was already clear that the situation had grown teeth far sharper than zoning disagreements and bruised egos. The benches were packed with legal observers, county staff, and a few unfortunate Ridgeview homeowners who looked as though they had just realized their dream homes were built on a legal sinkhole. Karen arrived with an entire entourage. 2 attorneys, 1 image consultant, the posture of someone still pretending the stage lights could redeem the script. The prosecution opened with a procedural overview of irregular documentation and unauthorized expansion, a phrase so polite it bordered on sarcasm. Then came the slides, layered overlays of cadastral maps, satellite imaging, authentication trails. They walked the court through every discrepancy like a surgeon describing a tumor in clinical poetry. When the contractors testified, the tone shifted. Several admitted they had been instructed not to question sudden boundary changes. One described how revised site maps appeared overnight and how Karen had dismissed concerns by calling them administrative optimizations. The word settled in the room like a cold joke. Karen's attorneys tried to introduce her as merely a well-meaning association leader misled by overzealous developers. It almost worked until my surveillance footage of the attempted electrical tampering was played. The screen showed 2 men fumbling at my junction box, sparks flaring in the dark, and the courtroom collectively inhaled like one organism realizing the threat had crossed into criminal intent. The judge leaned forward. You could tell when that happened because suddenly even the shuffling papers froze. Then Richard stood. He did not shout. He did not dramatize. He simply unfolded fact after fact with calm, merciless precision. The forged relinquishment document, the falsified signature, the fabricated notary seal, the misaligned timestamps. He presented communications where Karen explicitly authorized accelerated correction methods on my land, despite knowing the state inspection was pending. My name was repeated again and again in the narrative, but not as an instigator, as the obstruction, the inconvenience, the problem that refused to lay down and let the machinery roll. When Karen was called to the stand, she maintained her composure with the stubborn grace of someone clinging to a narrative already collapsing. She claimed ignorance, delegated blame, cited procedural confusion, but the evidence stack grew taller with every season of denial. The judge ordered a formal criminal inquiry into the actions of Ridgeview HOA and Kent and Ryder Development Group. The words potential conspiracy and coordinated financial misconduct echoed through the chamber like a quiet thunderclap. Outside the courthouse, reporters tried to intercept me with microphones and carefully rehearsed empathy. I declined with equal care. The truth did not need commentary. It needed documentation. As Karen exited the building, flanked by her legal team, our eyes locked for one fleeting second. Her confidence had dulled. The smile was gone. In its place lived the realization that paper, power, and posture were no longer sufficient armor, and for the first time since this nightmare began, the air carried a familiar scent, not of dust, not of diesel, but of consequences. The second hearing was no longer described as precautionary. It had evolved officially and unmistakably into a criminal proceeding. The tone inside the courthouse shifted accordingly. Gone were the polite euphemisms and procedural soft edges. In their place stood precise language that carried weight, consequence, and the unmistakable gravity of legal reckoning. Karen arrived without her entourage this time, just her attorneys and a face that looked as though it had been introduced for the first time to the concept of inevitability. The developers' seats were partially empty. Word traveled fast when indictments started whispering through professional circles. The prosecution laid out the complete chain of fraud with methodical precision. How Kent and Ryder Development Group knowingly submitted altered boundary schematics. How those documents passed through internal HOA approval without legitimate verification. How Karen's own email correspondence proved awareness of pending state inspection, while authorizing continued encroachment nonetheless. The digital trail was mapped on a massive screen, like a roadmap to willful deception. When the judge ordered Karen to stand, there was no theatrical delay. Just a quiet, undeniable pivot in narrative power. She was formally charged with conspiracy to commit property fraud, contempt of court, and intentional misrepresentation of mental wellness documentation produced against a private citizen. My name was not spoken as the center of her crime, only the location where it had surfaced. Brian Ryder's involvement was expanded upon, frozen assets, seized records, multiple shell accounts revealed through forensic accounting. The courtroom absorbed it in silence that felt sharp. The verdict phase unfolded without spectacle. Karen Malloy was found guilty on all primary counts and sentenced to 11 years in state correctional custody without early release eligibility under aggravated fraud classification. Brian Ryder received 14 years for organized financial misconduct and illegal territorial acquisition. The county zoning official implicated through falsified approval routing was sentenced to 7 years for corruption and procedural abuse. No one gasped. No one applauded. The silence was complete. A machine does not react to consequences. It processes them. Karen's expression did not break until the bailiff placed a hand on her arm and guided her toward the exit for transfer processing. Even then, her gaze did not seek sympathy. It searched for something else. In my direction. Then it slipped away like focus from a broken lens. Outside the building, the world behaved normally. Sunlight, wind, commuters, coffee. It was unsettling how indifferent the universe remained while inside it. An entire narrative had collapsed like faulty scaffolding. Richard finally spoke as we stepped onto the courthouse steps. "This isn't the end," he said quietly. "This is the moment it becomes irreversible." I nodded because I already knew. My land was still scarred, my boundary stakes still stood, and the silence that followed felt heavy with unfinished purpose. The machines were gone, but the scars they left remained like ghost lines etched into my soil. Where smooth Texas earth should have stretched undisturbed toward the horizon, there were jagged cuts, half-poured concrete, and the bones of a fantasy development that would never exist. Standing at the edge of the damage, I felt no triumph, no cinematic satisfaction. Just a slow, deliberate resolve to take back what had been mauled and make it mine again in a way that could not be rewritten, reinterpreted, or quietly stolen through the margins of corrupted paperwork. Restoration began at dawn, not with spectacle but with precision. Independent contractors, vetted and insured, arrived with equipment meant not to impose, but to heal. The broken slabs were dismantled piece by piece. Temporary roads were peeled away. Soil was regraded and aerated, corrected back to its original integrity using archived data from my grandfather's records. Every movement was calculated, verified, and documented. If this land had been a victim, it was now being rehabilitated with the same care it had once been surveyed. Near the center of the disputed zone, where the most aggressive construction had taken place, I chose to leave one foundation fragment intact, not as a wound, but as a marker, a reminder. A statement that no future developer, no insulated authority, and no overly ambitious association could ignore. A local metalworker fabricated the plaque exactly as I instructed, and I personally bolted it onto the preserved concrete face. The engraving was simple, unyielding, private property. They built without permission. Here, justice stood its ground. Word spread quietly. Not through news channels or social campaigns, but through legal circles, through quiet testimonies of people who had once felt too small to fight back. Within weeks, I was contacted by landowners across the state facing similar development misunderstandings. Some were subtle, some nearly identical, all carried the same signature pattern of intimidation and quiet bureaucratic manipulation. So I began something else on the side of the reclaiming. With Richard's guidance, I helped establish a legal aid initiative dedicated to identifying fraudulent HOA overreach, not a headline-hunting movement, a surgical one. We collected cases, uncovered buried documentation, and ensured that what had happened on my land became something far more difficult to repeat elsewhere. Plans for the future no longer felt endangered. The solar array project resumed, redesigned to strengthen both my independence and the long-term sustainability of the property. The house I intended to build no longer represented retreat. It represented home, stability, ownership that could not be dissolved by convenience or cowardice. One evening, as the sun lowered behind the trees my grandfather had once marked by hand, I walked the perimeter again. The ground was steady beneath my boots. The stakes stood where they should. And for the first time in a very long stretch of time, the land did not feel like a battlefield. It felt like what it had always been meant to be: mine.